Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. I'd like to point out a bug that I found inside the scene class. If we go into the scene.h file, inside here we've declared a std map to contain all of our node textures. Now the way that this works is we associate a file name with a node texture pointer. The way that the map structure stores all this data, it sorts all the file names according to the texture comparison structure which we created up above. Well, this poses a problem whenever we want to call select texture ID. If we scroll down here, we'll see we're searching for our ID number that gets passed in. And to find that specific ID number, what I was doing, I would start at the beginning of this map and then iterate through for however many numbers that the ID number requested. So for instance, if the ID number was 3, we would go through looking for the third item in our map. Well, this isn't correct because the third item in the map may not have an ID value of 3. And that's because everything gets sorted alphabetically. So the third item is actually the third alphabetical item in the list. Now that's not what we want. We could go through this for loop, and as we're going through it, search for ID number 3 within each map element. That's not going to be a very good solution because we want to be able to specify I want the third item in our list so that I can get it very quickly. I don't want to have to search through the entire list of all the node textures that I have looking for the one that I need. So what we need to do is get rid of this std map completely and replace it with a vector. If we use vectors, we can then specify we want the third item, and then the third item will be returned to us immediately. We don't need to search through the entire vector to find the third item. So to start making all these changes over from std map to std vector, let's go back into the scene.h file here and replace this member variable with the following. We're going to replace map with vector, and we're no longer going to be needing the file name here, so we're just going to delete that. We're going to leave node texture pointer here because that's what our vector is going to contain, and we don't need this comparison anymore. The other thing I'm going to change is the name of our member variable from mmp textures to mvp textures, because now it's a vector, not a map. Now since we're removing the texture comparison, that means we can go up here to the top and delete this structure. We're not going to need it anymore. Now to quickly find everywhere that we used our mmp textures, we can compile our code, and everywhere where we generate an error message, that's where we need to go and change our code. Okay. So starting off inside the select texture function. What we were doing before was using the find function to look in our map for the specific file name. If we found it, we would then continue on down. If we didn't find it, we generate an error message. Well, now we need another way to do the same thing. We can start off by doing the following. I'll create a member variable here called beFound, and I'll set it to false. Then I create an iterator, which is going to start at the beginning of our textures. It's going to go through our entire vector, all the way up to the very end. While it's going through each element, it's going to take the file name stored inside the node texture and compare it with the file name that gets passed into our select texture function up here. If these two are equal, then this strCompare function will return 0, so then we can set beFound equals to true. And we can break out so we don't have to continue looking. If we don't find it, then we'll continue looping through here, and then we'll exit, and beFound will be equal to false. So when we get down here, if beFound is equal to false, we want to run all this stuff down here because that was what we needed to do if the texture wasn't found. So we can call this, if not found, we'll then disable the textures and we'll delete our memory that was allocated up here above. Now you may be wondering, where did this variable here sz file name come from? Well, we need to go into our node texture and modify that class as well so that we can actually store the file name that we're loading inside each texture now. Before we didn't do that, before we stored it in the map, but now we need to actually store it inside the node texture class. So let's go and add this file name into our node texture now. We'll open up nodetexture.h, and scrolling down here under the public members, we'll add the following member. Now it's going to be the file name, and it's going to have enough size to hold 260 characters, plus 1 for the null character at the end. Inside a constructor, we need to initialize this. So let's save this and go into our constructor. Now when our constructor gets called, we don't have a file associated yet, so we're just going to set that member variable equal to null. So there's nothing stored in here. Now when a file does load successfully, we need to be able to store the file name into our node texture class. So let's go down in here and take a look. We call load from outside, which will go through here and determine whether it's a file format that we support. If it's a TGA file, we're going to call load TGA. And then we're going to go through this function here all the way down to the very bottom. And at the bottom, if everything succeeds, we'll then go and save the file name. If this function doesn't succeed, it'll return false. And if that happens, then our file name will still be at the same value that our constructor had originally, which is just null. Okay, so those are the changes we needed to make to node texture class. Now let's go back to scene.cpp. Back inside select texture, let's take a look to see if there's something else we need to change here. Here I see we're using the map to get the number of bits per pixel that our specific file is using. Well, we no longer have our map, so we need to replace this with the following. We can take the iterator value and just use that to get the number of bits per pixel that our texture file is using. We can do the same thing down here where we need the ID number for the specific texture. Okay, I think that should be it for the select texture function. Let's go and save this and recompile it. We should find some more errors inside select texture ID now. Okay, so here we go. First thing we need to do is change this here from a mem to a v. Since we no longer have a map, we have a vector instead. And we can get rid of this part here since we no longer need to do a search through our map to find our specific texture. Instead, since we're using a vector now, we can access the data directly. And the way we do it is the following. We call our member variable and we pass in the ID number that's requested minus 1, since our vector values start from 0 but our ID numbers start from 1. So if we're looking for the first item, UID here will be 1, but inside our vector the value has to be starting from 0. So we can get the number of bits per pixel just by calling the following. Looks like that's all we have to change here in the select texture ID function. Let's go and compile this and make some more changes. Okay, the change that we have to make here is going to be similar to the one we did in select texture. We need to go search through our map to find a specific file name. Well, we can do the same thing now using an iterator and iterating through our vector of textures. So we start at the beginning, we go through all the way to the end, and we compare the file name with the file name that's passed in here. If they're equal, we set our local variable here be found to be true, and then we break out. Now with this if statement down here, all we need to do is check to see if we found the specific texture. If we did find the texture, then we don't need to load a new one, so we just delete the pointer that we initialized up above, and down here we'll get the ID number. We'll use that to get the return value. We call safe delete for the memory that we allocated up here above. And down here we can change this from an M to a V. And the other thing we need to change is this following line. This is where we stored our no texture pointer into our map. To store data into our vector, we need to call pushback. So we'll write the following code. MVP textures.pushback, and we push back the pointer to the texture node that we're working with here up above. Okay, let's save that and compile. See if there's anything else we need to change. Texture compares not identified. Okay, inside delete all textures, we need to modify this as well since we're no longer using maps. So I'm just going to replace all of this code with the following new code. We go through our vector using an iterator from the start all the way to the end, iterating one step at a time. And every time through, we're just going to call delete for the following iterator value. And again, this is the same thing as calling delete text, where textures is a no texture pointer. Then when we're done, we just clear the vector completely so that it doesn't contain any pointers at all. Let's try compiling again, see if there's anything else. Oh, looks like that's it. Okay, let's try running it just to make sure that everything, oh, I have to build it first. Let's try running it to make sure everything still works the way it worked before at the end of the last VMK. Okay, and it does.